The mysterious bride. The desert wind howled like a hungry beast, kicking up clouds of dust that clung to everything. Captain Daniel Carter wiped the grit from his face, squinting against the harsh sun. His ship, or what was left of it, lay half-buried in the sand behind him. A burning wreck, its engine ruined beyond repair. He was stranded. Drax 7 was supposed to be a routine stop, a forgotten, barren planet with no real value. He had planned to refuel, restock supplies, and leave. But now, his only way off this rock was gone. Daniel sighed, adjusting his survival pack. Water was low. The heat was relentless. He had two choices: sit here and die or move. He chose to move. For hours, he walked through the endless desert, each step heavier than the last. The sun burned his skin. His throat felt like sandpaper. He was starting to think he wouldn't make it when he spotted something in the distance. A village. Small, built from stone and metal scraps. It looked ancient, like it had been standing for centuries. Daniel forced his tired legs forward, stumbling toward the settlement. He didn't know if the locals were friendly, but at this point, it didn't matter. He needed water, shelter, anything. As he entered the village, eyes turned toward him. The people were humanoid, but their skin had a slight silver hue, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. They wore simple robes, covered in dust, their faces wrapped to shield them from the wind. One of them stepped forward. A woman. She was tall, her long dark hair braided down her back. Her robes were simple, but there was something about her, something different. Her eyes, golden and piercing, studied him with quiet intelligence. "You are lost," she said. Her voice was smooth, steady. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "You could say that." She tilted her head, then gestured for him to follow. He hesitated but knew he had no better option. She led him to a small hut, where she poured him a cup of water from a clay jug. Daniel drank greedily, the cool liquid bringing him back to life. "Thank you," he said. The woman watched him carefully. "You are not from here." "No," he admitted. "My ship crashed. I need a way off this planet." The woman's expression didn't change. "There is no way off this planet." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced out the window, where the sun was setting over the dunes. "Drax 7 is forgotten. No ships come here. No one leaves." A sinking feeling settled in Daniel's stomach. If that was true, then he was stuck here forever. "Then how did you get here?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "I was born here." Daniel didn't believe her. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she carried herself. She didn't seem like the others. "What's your name?" he asked. "Zyra." He nodded. "I'm Daniel." For the next few days, Zyra helped Daniel adjust to life in the village. She showed him how to find clean water, how to trade with the locals, how to avoid the dangerous creatures that roamed the desert at night. She was strong, capable, and mysterious. Despite the hardships, Daniel found himself drawn to her. She was different from anyone he had ever met. She spoke little of her past, always changing the subject when he asked too many questions. But in her eyes, he saw something deep, something hidden. Then, one night, the village was attacked. A group of raiders, their faces covered with masks, stormed into the settlement, setting fires and stealing supplies. The villagers screamed, running for cover. Daniel grabbed a metal rod, ready to fight, but before he could react, Zyra was already in motion. She moved like a shadow, fast and deadly. With precise strikes, she took down 3 raiders in seconds. The others hesitated, then fled, disappearing into the night. The villagers whispered among themselves, staring at Zyra with both fear and respect. Daniel caught his breath, staring at her. "Who are you?" he asked. For the first time, Zyra looked unsure. She turned away. "It doesn't matter," she said. But it did matter. Daniel knew it. As time passed, their bond grew stronger. Zira was unlike anyone he had ever met. Fierce but kind, guarded but caring. And despite the harshness of the desert, he found himself wanting to stay. Then, one evening, as they sat beneath the stars, Zira spoke. "If you could leave," she asked, "would you?" Daniel thought about it. A few weeks ago, he would have said yes without hesitation. But now he wasn't so sure. "Maybe," he admitted, "but only if you come with me." She looked away, something unreadable in her expression. The next day, Zira came to him with a proposal. "I want you to marry me," she said. Daniel blinked. "What?" "It is our way," she explained. "If you marry into the village, you will have protection. You will have a home." It was sudden, unexpected, but when Daniel looked at her, he realized. He wanted this. He wanted her, so he said yes. The village prepared a simple ceremony. Zira wore white robes, her hair braided with silver rings. Daniel stood beside her, his heart pounding. The elder spoke the sacred words, and just like that, they were bound. As the villagers cheered, Daniel turned to Zira, smiling. "Guess I'm part of the family now." She smiled back, but in her eyes there was something else, something hidden. That night, as Daniel lay beside her, a strange beeping sound filled the air. Zira reached into her robes, pulling out a small device. A hologram appeared, a message. Her face turned cold. "It's time to return," she whispered. Daniel sat up, confused. "Return where?" But before she could answer, the night sky exploded with light. A massive spaceship was descending toward the village. Everything Daniel thought he knew was about to change. The sudden departure. The ground trembled. Daniel's breath caught as he stared at the massive spaceship descending from the night sky. The village, once quiet and forgotten, was now bathed in an eerie blue glow. The sleek, black metal of the ship reflected the firelight from the torches below, making it look like a beast of the stars, descending to claim its prey. Villagers ran in fear, shouting in their native tongue. Some dropped to their knees, murmuring prayers, while others rushed to hide. But Zira stood completely still. Her golden eyes glowed faintly in the artificial light as she clutched the strange device in her hands. Daniel saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the communicator just a little too tightly. She knew this ship. "Zira," Daniel said, stepping closer. "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer. The ship's hull hissed open, releasing a ramp that extended smoothly onto the desert floor. Out of the darkness, a group of armored figures emerged, tall, imposing, and heavily armed. Their armor gleamed like obsidian, and their helmets bore intricate engravings. Then one of them stepped forward. Unlike the others, this figure didn't wear a helmet. Instead, he had sharp, regal features, his silver-toned skin flawless and unmarked. His deep purple robes, lined with silver embroidery, were a stark contrast to the dust-covered rags of the villagers. His glowing eyes landed on Zira, and he did something unexpected. He bowed. "My lady," he said, his voice smooth but firm, "the High Lord demands your return." Silence fell over the village. Daniel looked at Zira. She hadn't moved. Her face was unreadable, but her fingers twitched slightly, like she was deciding whether to fight or comply. Daniel's stomach twisted. Who was she? "You have been gone too long," the armored man continued. "The royal court grows restless. The succession must be secured. Your father—" "Enough," Zira interrupted. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the night air like a blade. Daniel had never heard her speak like that before. Gone was the quiet, mysterious woman who had lived among the villagers. In her place stood someone, powerful, someone used to giving orders. Zira turned to Daniel. "Come with me." His heart pounded. "What?" "There's no time to explain," she said, her voice urgent. "But I swear to you, everything I've done, everything I've said, was real." Daniel's mind raced. Just hours ago, he had been celebrating his marriage to this woman, believing she was just a simple villager. Now heavily armed soldiers were bowing to her, calling her lady, talking about a throne. Nothing made sense. "Zura," he said slowly, "who are you?" She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she whispered, "I am Zyra Vexus, firstborn daughter of the High Lord, heir to the Draxian Empire." Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. And heir, a princess. He had married a royal without even knowing it. His first instinct was to step back, but Zyra's hand shot out, gripping his wrist. "Come with me," she repeated. "If you stay, you'll die." Before Daniel could respond, the armored man barked an order in his native tongue. The soldiers moved. In seconds, they had surrounded Daniel and Zyra, their weapons raised. The lead soldier's face remained calm, but his words were cold. "The High Lord was not expecting a human consort," he said. "He may not approve." Daniel scowled. "Approve? What am I? A pet?" Zyra's grip tightened. "We don't have time for this," she snapped at the soldier. "We leave. Now." The soldier hesitated, then nodded. With a wave of his hand, the others lowered their weapons, and the group moved toward the ship. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped onto the sleek metallic ramp, feeling the gravity shift beneath his feet. The moment they crossed the threshold, the door sealed shut behind them with a hiss. Inside, the ship was immaculate, lined with smooth black walls and glowing blue interfaces. The technology was far beyond anything Daniel had seen. The soldier led them through a long corridor until they reached the command chamber, a vast, open space filled with holographic displays. A large map of the galaxy flickered in the center, different star systems marked in bright red. Daniel's eyes landed on one section of the map. A hologram of his own face appeared, flickering with a label underneath it. Unknown 38. His stomach dropped. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. Zyra's expression darkened. "I didn't want you to see this." "See what?" He turned to her, his voice sharp. "That your people think I'm a threat. That I'm some kind of enemy. It's complicated." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Try me." Before Zyra could respond, the ship's communication panel crackled to life. A deep, commanding voice filled the chamber. "Zyra." Zyra froze. Daniel watched as her entire posture changed. The fierce, battle-hardened warrior he had fought beside in the village was gone. In her place was someone tense, someone uncertain. "I'm here, Father," she said quietly. The holographic screen shifted, revealing the face of a man who looked terrifyingly similar to Zyra, only older, colder. His silver skin was marked with deep scars, his golden eyes burning with authority. He wore a high-collared royal uniform, lined with dark armor. The High Lord. Daniel could feel the weight of the man's gaze even through the hologram. He had the air of someone who was used to commanding entire armies, someone who would not hesitate to crush planets if it suited him. His golden eyes flickered to Daniel. "And who," the High Lord asked, his voice dangerously soft, "is this human?" Daniel met the man's gaze, forcing himself to stay calm. But before he could answer, Zyra stepped forward, lifting her chin. "He is my husband," she said firmly. "By Draxian law, he is part of our family now." Silence. Then the High Lord let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Husband," he repeated. "We shall see." The hologram flickered out. Then the ship's pilot turned, his expression grim. "We are ordered to return to the royal capital immediately," he announced. "The High Lord has summoned the human for the royal trials." Daniel frowned. "The what?" Zyra's expression darkened. "If you fail," she said softly, "they will execute you." Daniel exhaled slowly, his fists clenching. Just hours ago, he had thought he was marrying a simple, dusty alien woman. Now he was about to fight for his life in an alien empire. The hidden truth. Daniel sat in the dimly lit chamber of the starship, his mind racing. The smooth hum of the ship's engines filled the silence, but his thoughts were louder. He had spent weeks on Drax 7, believing Zyra was a simple desert woman. They had fought together, bulled together. He had married her, thinking it was just a small, intimate bond. But now, he was aboard a royal warship, heading toward the heart of an empire he knew nothing about, and his face was listed under Unknown 38. And worse, if he failed the royal trials, he would die. Across the chamber, Zyra stood rigid, staring out of the observation window at the swirling hyperspace tunnel. The glow from the starfield reflected against her face, making her golden eyes look distant, troubled. Daniel leaned forward. "You're gonna have to start talking now, princess." Zyra flinched slightly at the word, but didn't turn around. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." She exhaled, finally facing him. Her expression was unreadable. "I was never meant to marry. My father arranged my life long before I was born." Daniel frowned. "Arranged your life?" Zyra's jaw tightened. "The Draxian Empire is built on power. Our rulers are warriors, and our heirs are chosen, not born. I was trained from childhood to lead, to fight, to rule. Everything I did was part of a larger plan." Daniel scoffed. "So what happened? You just decided to run away." For the first time, Zyra looked uncertain. "It wasn't that simple," she said. "A war broke out between the royal families. Assassins came for my father. He fought them off, but the court was divided. Some wanted him gone, others wanted me dead so I could never inherit the throne." Daniel stiffened. "So you were hiding?" Zyra nodded. "He sent me away. Made it look like I had been killed in battle, so no one would come looking." Daniel leaned back. "And then you met me." She nodded again. But this time, her expression softened. "Yes, and for the first time in my life. I wasn't a princess. I wasn't a soldier. I was just Zyra." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Well, surprise. You're a princess and a soldier, and I'm about to get thrown into a death match because of it." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Zyra's voice was quiet. "I never meant for this to happen." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, well, here we are." Before she could respond, a ship's intercom buzzed. "Approaching the royal capital. Prepare for landing." Daniel stood up, running a hand through his hair. "Tell me what I need to know." Zyra hesitated before speaking. "The royal trials are a test of strength, intelligence, and survival. It's an ancient tradition. Every ruler's consort must pass them to prove they are worthy of standing beside an heir." Daniel frowned. "And if I fail?" Zyra's voice was barely a whisper. "They execute you." Daniel exhaled through his nose. No pressure, then. The arrival. The ship descended through thick clouds, revealing the royal capital of the Draxian Empire below. Daniel's breath caught. The city was massive, stretching beyond the horizon. Towering spires of black and silver reached into the sky, connected by glowing bridges. Hovercrafts zipped through the air, and enormous golden statues of past rulers stood at the entrance of a vast palace. The imperial palace itself was a fortress, its dark metal walls shimmering under the twin suns. The entire structure was carved into the mountain, with thousands of banners flowing from its balconies. As the ship touched down on the landing pad, a formation of royal guards stood waiting. They wore heavy, obsidian-colored armor, their capes trimmed in violet. At the front of the formation stood a man Daniel instantly recognized, the High Lord, Zyra's father. His expression was unreadable as he watched them descend the ramp. The moment Zyra stepped forward, the soldiers dropped to one knee, saluting her. But when Daniel followed behind her, the High Lord's eyes narrowed. "So," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "this is the human." Daniel squared his shoulders, refusing to look intimidated. Daniel Carter. The High Lord's gaze was sharp, calculating. Then, without warning, he turned and began walking toward the palace. "The trials begin tomorrow." Daniel blinked. "That's it. No introduction. No grand speech." The High Lord paused, turning his head slightly. "I do not waste words on men who may not survive the night." Then he was gone. Daniel clenched his jaw. Charming. Zira touched his arm gently. "Be careful." Daniel sighed. "Yeah, that's what I'm worried about." The first trial. Strength. The next morning, Daniel stood in the center of a massive circular arena, surrounded by thousands of Draxian nobles. Zira was on the royal balcony, standing beside her father. She looked tense. Daniel didn't blame her. Because across from him, stepping into the arena, was a beast the size of a shuttle. It was called a Vorlak, a reptilian nightmare with blackened scales, 6 glowing red eyes, and massive claws sharp enough to slice through steel. A voice boomed across the arena. "The first trial begins. The human must defeat the Vorlak, or be consumed." Daniel swallowed. "Well," he muttered, rolling his shoulders, "guess it's time to prove I married up." The beast charged. Daniel barely had time to react before he was diving sideways, narrowly avoiding the Vorlak's snapping jaws. The ground shook as it landed, its claws raking across the stone floor. Daniel rolled to his feet, scanning his surroundings. No weapons, no armor. Just him, his instincts, and a stadium full of people waiting for his death. The Vorlak turned, bearing rows of jagged teeth. It lunged again, this time faster. Daniel didn't run. He ran toward it. The crowd gasped as he sidestepped at the last second, grabbing hold of one of the beast's spikes and swinging onto its back. The Vorlak roared, thrashing wildly, but Daniel held on, using its own momentum against it. Then, with all his strength, he drove his fist into its eye. The beast screamed, staggering. Daniel saw his opening. He reached for one of its spines, sharp and jagged like a blade. And with a grunt, he tore it free. The crowd roared in shock. Daniel didn't waste time. He drove the spine deep into the Vorlak's skull. The beast collapsed. Silence. Then, an eruption of cheers. Daniel staggered back, panting. He looked up toward the royal balcony, where the High Lord narrowed his eyes. Daniel smirked. "Round 1, he muttered. "Not bad for a human." The deadly chase. The arena still echoed with cheers, but Daniel barely had time to catch his breath. The Vorlak lay dead at his feet, its massive form twitching as dark blood pooled around it. The air smelled of scorched stone and beast sweat. Above him, in the royal balcony, the High Lord stood still as a statue. His golden eyes studied Daniel with unreadable intensity. The rest of the noble court murmured amongst themselves, some in shock, others in amusement. Daniel turned his gaze toward Zira. She stood tense, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But when their eyes met, she gave the smallest nod. Daniel exhaled. 1 trial down. 2 to go. Then the High Lord raised his hand, and the arena fell silent. The human has proven himself against the beast, his deep voice carried across the stadium. But a consort is not just a warrior. He must be a survivor. Daniel's stomach twisted. Oh, that didn't sound good. The High Lord turned to one of his generals. "Prepare the next trial." A loud metallic clank echoed through the arena as a massive door slid open. From the shadows, 5 armored figures emerged, tall, deadly, and moving with the precision of elite killers. Their armor was different from the royal guards, sleek, black, and fitted with glowing blue energy veins. Assassins. Daniel didn't like this. "These," the High Lord continued, "are the Night Hunters, the deadliest warriors in the Empire. They do not fight with honor. They do not fight for sport. They hunt. And you, human, are their prey." A sharp alarm blared from the arena walls. Trial 2 begins now. The assassins moved instantly. Daniel's survival instincts kicked in. He ducked just as a dagger flew past his head, embedding itself in the stone wall behind him. He turned and ran. A deadly hunt. Daniel sprinted through the stone corridors of the palace, his heart pounding. The architects of this place hadn't been kind enough to design it with escape routes. The halls twisted and turned, each passageway leading into another, a perfect hunting ground for assassins. Behind him, the night hunters moved like ghosts, silent, unstoppable. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. Bad idea. One of them lunged from the shadows, their blades slashing toward his throat. Daniel twisted away at the last second, the cold metal slicing just above his collarbone. Pain flared, but he had no time to react. The assassin was already moving again. Daniel ducked under a second swing, using his momentum to slam his elbow into the assassin's ribs. The blow barely staggered them. Then, the assassin vanished. Daniel cursed. They could cloak. He kept running. His brain worked overtime, scanning the environment for something. Anything that could help. His weapons were stripped before the trials. He had no armor, no advanced tech, just his instincts, and a growing sense of pissed-off determination. The rooftop chase. Daniel burst through a heavy door, emerging onto a high rooftop balcony. The view was breathtaking. The entire city stretched below, shimmering under the glow of the twin moons. But he had no time to admire the scenery, because the night hunters were already here. One of them stepped out of the shadows, blade gleaming. Another materialized behind Daniel, cutting off his escape. Trapped. The lead assassin tilted his head. Run all you want, human. It only delays the inevitable. Daniel wiped the blood from his shoulder. Yeah. Well, you guys sure talk a lot for silent killers. The assassin smirked. Very well. They attacked. The first moved like lightning, a blur of deadly precision. Daniel barely had time to react. He dodged left, but a second assassin lashed out with a spinning kick, sending him sprawling onto the stone. Pain exploded in his ribs. Before he could recover, a boot slammed down on his chest, pinning him. The lead assassin loomed over him, raising his dagger. Time to die. Then, boom. A plasma bolt streaked through the air, slamming into the assassin's shoulder. Daniel gasped as the figure collapsed beside him, a smoking hole in their armor. More shots rang out. Daniel rolled away, just as the assassins turned their attention to the source of the attack. Above them, standing on a hovering speeder bike, was Zyra. Her rifle smoked, her golden eyes burning with fury. Get up, she shouted. Move. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He ran. Zyra threw him a second rifle, and he caught it mid-stride. Finally, a weapon. The night hunters recovered fast. One of them lunged at Zyra, but she fired first, 2 precise shots to the chest. The assassin collapsed before they even hit the ground. Daniel turned just in time to block a strike with the rifle stock, twisting and delivering a savage elbow to his attacker's jaw. The assassin stumbled, and Daniel slammed the butt of the rifle against their temple. The body crumpled. Zyra gunned the speeder bike, pulling it alongside Daniel. Get on. Daniel jumped, grabbing onto the side as the bike shot off the rooftop. Behind them, the remaining assassins opened fire. Bolts of blue energy streaked through the night, barely missing them. Daniel turned, firing back, his pulse hammering. One of the assassins dodged, but not fast enough. A well-aimed shot struck their leg, sending them tumbling off the rooftop. The last assassin pursued them, leaping onto a second speeder bike. Zyra cursed. They're gaining. Daniel's mind raced. Take us higher. Zyra didn't question him. She pulled back on the controls, and the bike shot into the sky, skimming above the city's tallest towers. The assassin followed, but that was a mistake. Daniel twisted in his seat, gripping his rifle. He exhaled slowly, focused, then fired. The shot hit the assassin's control panel. The speeder bike exploded. The assassin vanished in a fireball, crashing far below into the city streets. Silence. The chase was over. Daniel exhaled, adrenaline still coursing through him. Well, he muttered, that was fun. Zyra glared at him. You almost died. He grinned. But I didn't. She sighed, shaking her head. But there was something else in her eyes. Something warm. She turned the speeder toward the palace. Come on. My father will want to see you now. Daniel groaned. Great. Can't wait. As they flew toward the towering fortress, one thought burned in his mind. 2 trials down. 1 more to go. And something told him. The worst was yet to come. The trials of the heir's husband. Daniel stood in the grand throne chamber, his body aching from the brutal chase. His shoulder still throbbed from the night hunter's attack, and the wound above his collarbone was crusted with dried blood. He hadn't had time to treat it. Not that anyone seemed to care. The High Lord sat on his massive throne, his expression unreadable. The throne itself was carved from obsidian stone, its edges lined with glowing violet energy. A seat meant for conquerors, not rulers. Zira stood beside her father, her face cold and unreadable. She wasn't looking at Daniel. The court whispered among themselves, murmuring in their alien language. The human survived. The trials should have killed him. This is not tradition. Daniel clenched his jaw. They didn't expect me to make it this far. The High Lord finally spoke. You have endured the beast trial. You have survived the hunt. His golden eyes pierced through Daniel like twin daggers. But strength and survival alone are not enough. A consort of an heir must also be worthy. Daniel stiffened. I don't like the way you said that. The High Lord gave the smallest smirk. Your final trial will not be one of brute force, but of mind. Daniel frowned. Mind. A hollow boom echoed through the chamber as a massive iron door opened at the far end of the throne room. Daniel turned. A figure stepped out. A man. Taller than Daniel. Stronger. His armor black and gold, engraved with the symbols of the Draxian Empire. His hair, jet black, was tied behind his head in thick braids. His golden eyes gleamed with amusement, but there was a dangerous hunger behind them. Zira tensed beside her father. Daniel felt something cold crawl up his spine. The High Lord exhaled, as if savoring the moment. Meet Varian, he said. My firstborn son. Your final opponent. Daniel's stomach dropped. He hadn't just been competing to prove his worth. He had been competing against Zira's older brother. The duel of the princes. Varian smirked, stepping forward. His presence alone carried weight. His armor was heavier than Daniel's entire body, but the way he moved, it was effortless. You've been causing quite the stir, human, he said, his voice smooth but dangerous. People are saying you might actually survive this. Daniel rolled his shoulders. Yeah, that bothers you. Varian grinned. Oh, not at all. I welcome it. Daniel glanced at Zira, but she remained stone-faced. She hadn't spoken since the trial was announced. The High Lord leaned forward. This is the final trial, he declared. 2 warriors enter. Only one will claim the right to stand beside the heir. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Wait. So if I lose, Zira has to marry him. Varian laughed. No, idiot. If you lose, you die. Daniel sighed. Right. Should have known. A guard stepped forward, presenting 2 weapons, one for each fighter. A plasma-forged sword, humming with energy, and a dagger laced with a paralytic toxin. Daniel eyed them both, then picked up the sword. I don't like poison. Feels cheap. Varian chuckled, taking the dagger. You really are a fool. Daniel adjusted his grip on the sword. Yeah. Well, let's see who the bigger fool is. The High Lord raised his hand. A hush fell over the throne chamber. Then, he dropped his hand, and the duel began. A fight against a prince. Varian moved first. He closed the gap in a second, his dagger flashing. Daniel barely dodged. The blade whistled past his throat, missing by inches. Varian was fast. Too fast. Daniel swung his sword, but Varian sidestepped effortlessly, twisting behind him. A sharp kick to Daniel's ribs sent him staggering. He barely caught himself before hitting the ground. Varian smirked. Come on, human. You made it this far. Surely you're not going to fall so easily. Daniel gritted his teeth. He'd fought beasts, assassins, and survived the harshest landscapes. But Varian was something else entirely. He was trained for this. He was born for this. And Daniel had been a crash-landed nobody just weeks ago. But he wasn't a nobody anymore. He exhaled. Then he attacked. Varian's smirk vanished as Daniel's sword swung toward him, forcing him to block. The moment their weapons met, a burst of blue sparks erupted. Daniel didn't stop. He moved, faster, harder, sharper ***, every strike aimed with purpose ***. Varian blocked once, twice. On the third swing, he stumbled. His eyes flickered with something new. Annoyance. You're better than I thought, he admitted. Daniel grinned, despite the pain in his ribs. You're worse than I thought. Varian snarled and attacked harder. Blades clashed. Every strike sent shocks up Daniel's arm. He could feel the force behind every blow, could feel the weight of a lifetime of training bearing down on him. But Daniel had something Varian didn't. He had fought for survival before. Varian fought like a warrior. Daniel fought like a survivor. Varian lunged. Daniel dropped low, sliding beneath him, then slashed upward. The blade cut through Varian's shoulder armor, sending a spray of dark blood into the air. The prince stumbled back, cursing. The court gasped. The High Lord's eyes narrowed. Daniel stood his ground, his chest rising and falling. His muscles burned. His grip tightened. Varian looked at his bleeding shoulder, then at Daniel. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Daniel smiled. Looks like I'm still standing, Prince. Varian's expression twisted. He lunged. But this time, Daniel was ready. He dodged, sidestepped, then slammed his sword hilt into Varian's gut. The prince dropped to one knee, coughing. Daniel raised his blade. One strike. One final blow. The room held its breath. But Daniel hesitated. He wasn't an assassin. He wasn't a killer. He lowered his sword. I'm not killing you, he said. But I won't bow either. Varian slowly looked up, his golden eyes burning with something unreadable. Then, to Daniel's surprise, Varian laughed. Loud, genuine. He wiped the blood from his mouth and shook his head. You really are something, human. Daniel smirked. Yeah, I get that a lot. He turned to the High Lord. Well, that good enough for you? The High Lord stared at him for a long moment. Then he stood, and he smiled. You have proven yourself. The court erupted into shouts. Zira exhaled sharply. And Daniel grinned. He had survived. But somehow, he knew the real battle was just beginning. The final trial. The grand hall of the Draxian royal court was still buzzing with murmurs. The nobles, warriors, and diplomats whispered amongst themselves, some in awe, some in disbelief. A human had survived the trials. Daniel stood in the center of the throne room, still gripping his sword. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, sweat glistening on his skin. Across from him, Varian knelt on one knee, still clutching his wounded shoulder. A trickle of dark blood ran down his arm, staining the intricate gold patterns on his armor. Yet, instead of anger, the prince was laughing. A deep, rich laugh that echoed through the chamber. The High Lord remained seated on his massive obsidian throne, his golden eyes locked onto Daniel. His expression was unreadable. Then he stood, his presence alone commanding the immediate silence of the entire court. Daniel swallowed. This is it, the moment that decides if I live or die. The High Lord's gaze drifted between his two children, Zyra standing tall and unreadable beside the throne, and Varian still kneeling with that smug, amused grin. Finally, the ruler spoke. You have done what no other outsider has accomplished. You have endured, survived, and bested my son in battle. Daniel kept his face neutral, but inside, he was holding his breath. Then the High Lord's expression shifted, just the faintest smirk. And yet, the true test remains. Daniel blinked. Wait, what? Before he could react, the floor beneath him rumbled. With a loud clang, a section of the throne chamber's floor split open, revealing a dark spiraling descent into the depths of the palace. Cold air rushed up from below, thick with the scent of metal, earth, and something ancient. Zyra's posture stiffened. Even Varian's smirk faded. The royal trials test more than just combat, the High Lord continued. They test strength, wit, and survival. But a true consort must prove something greater. Daniel's stomach turned. I have a feeling I'm not gonna like this. The High Lord ignored him, turning his gaze toward his daughter. Zyra, you know what comes next. She hesitated. Father, he's already proven. He has proven much, but not enough. The High Lord's golden eyes locked back onto Daniel. The final trial awaits. The tomb of the first emperor. The chamber fell silent. Even the whispers died. Daniel glanced at Zyra, but for the first time since he met her, he saw fear in her eyes. No one has entered the tomb and returned. Zyra's voice was soft, but it carried through the room. Even our strongest warriors have fallen to it. The High Lord nodded. Then let us see if the human is worthy of breaking that curse. A cold chill ran down Daniel's spine. The descent into the tomb. 2 guards escorted Daniel to the edge of the chasm. The dark, spiraling stairway led downward, vanishing into blackness. The air was cold, unnaturally so. Daniel glanced at Zyra. She stepped closer, keeping her voice low. This is madness. The trial was supposed to end with the duel. You're telling me. Daniel exhaled, adjusting the grip on his sword. What's waiting for me down there? Zyra's golden eyes flickered with hesitation. No one knows. Daniel blinked. Excuse me. She clenched her jaw. The first emperor, my ancestor, was buried with the strongest of our warriors to guard his crypt. Stories say his spirit still lingers, testing those who disturb his rest. Daniel rubbed his temples. So, I'm going into a haunted tomb filled with undead alien warriors. Great. Love that for me. Zyra's fingers brushed against his arm, her voice softer. You don't have to do this. He met her gaze, forcing a smirk, and miss out on the adventure. Not a chance. Despite herself, she smiled. But it faded quickly. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair. The stone doors slammed shut behind him. The trial of the dead. The deeper Daniel descended, the colder it got. The walls were carved with ancient inscriptions, depicting battles that had shaped the empire. Some showed a towering Draxian warlord, the first emperor, standing over the corpses of his enemies. At the bottom of the stairway, the passage opened into a vast underground chamber. Massive stone pillars lined the room, and in the center, atop an obsidian throne, sat a massive armored figure. The first emperor. His eyes were hollow, but the second Daniel stepped forward. A deep rumbling filled the chamber. The statue moved. Daniel froze as the massive warlord slowly stood. His armor, despite being thousands of years old, gleamed in the dim light. His golden eyes burned with unnatural energy. A voice, deep as the abyss, echoed through the chamber. Who dares enter my tomb? Daniel swallowed. Hi. The ancient warlord took a step forward, his massive blade scraping against the stone. Prove your worth, outsider, or be buried here for eternity. The ground shook as 3 armored warriors emerged from the shadows. Their armor was cracked with age, their weapons still deadly. Daniel's pulse spiked. The final trial had begun. The last stand. The first warrior charge. Daniel rolled aside, barely dodging the heavy axe that splintered the stone floor where he had stood. Before he could react, the second warrior swung a jagged blade, forcing Daniel to block with his sword. The impact rattled his bones. These things weren't just strong. They were relentless. The third warrior lunged at him, but Daniel dropped low, sliding between their legs, slashing his sword upward. His blade bit into ancient armor, sending the warrior crashing to the ground. One down. The second warrior came at him next, but Daniel used the weight of his opponent against him, sidestepping at the last moment and shoving him off balance. The warrior stumbled, crashing into a pillar, sending cracks through the ancient stone. Daniel turned to face the last warrior, only to realize the first emperor himself was moving toward him. His massive sword burned with golden fire. Oh, hell! Daniel barely had time to react before the ancient warlord swung. He dodged, barely, the blade carving a crater in the stone floor. Daniel knew he couldn't win this fight with strength alone. He needed to think. His eyes flicked to the crumbling pillar. An idea sparked. He baited the warlord, dodging until the ancient warrior was positioned right in front of it. Then, Daniel rolled aside, grabbing a fallen warrior's discarded axe, and hurled it at the pillar. The ancient stone gave way. The massive structure collapsed onto the first emperor. The tomb shook. And then, silence. Daniel panted, staring at the rubble. Then the warlord's voice echoed one last time. "You are worthy." The chamber filled with golden light, and the door to the surface opened. The human who survived. When Daniel emerged from the tomb, covered in dust and blood, the entire court stood in stunned silence. The High Lord met his gaze. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "You have earned your place." Daniel smirked, glancing at Sarah. "Told you I'd make it." But deep down, he knew. The real battle was only beginning. The new prince. The entire Draxian court stood in stunned silence as Daniel emerged from the tomb of the first emperor, his body covered in dust, sweat, and streaks of dried blood. His breathing was heavy, his muscles ached, but he was alive. The golden light of the twin suns bathed the royal throne hall, casting long shadows over the thousands of nobles, generals, and warriors who had gathered to witness the final trial. At the center of them all sat the High Lord, his golden eyes unreadable. Beside him stood Zyra, her fists clenched at her sides. The High Lord rose from his throne, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. "The tomb has judged you," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "And yet you stand before me." Daniel exhaled, rolling his sore shoulder. Yeah, it wasn't exactly welcoming. A ripple of murmurs spread through the court. Some laughed at his audacity, others whispered in shock. A human daring to speak so casually to the ruler of an empire. The High Lord's expression remained unreadable. "You have endured my trials," he said. "You have fought, survived, and stood against my son in combat. You have ventured into the tomb and returned." His gaze hardened. "But that does not mean you are worthy of my daughter." A fresh wave of whispers erupted. Zyra flinched, her golden eyes narrowing. "Father." "Silence," the High Lord ordered. Zyra's jaw tightened, but she did not protest further. Daniel, however, crossed his arms. "So let me get this straight. I survived everything you threw at me, and now you're telling me it still isn't enough." The High Lord stepped closer, now only a few feet from him. The air between them was tense. "You are strong," the High Lord admitted. "You are resilient. But those alone do not make a ruler. Tell me, human, why should I allow you to stand beside my heir?" Daniel held his gaze. He had expected this. This wasn't about strength anymore. It was about power, politics, legacy. Daniel inhaled. "Because Zyra chose me." The court gasped. The High Lord's expression darkened. "What did you say?" Daniel didn't flinch. "She chose me. She didn't choose a noble. She didn't choose a warrior from your bloodline. She didn't choose someone you picked for her. She chose me." The court fell into a stunned silence. Daniel continued, his voice firm. "You sent her away. You faked her death. But even after all that, she still came back. She still fought for this empire. She still fought for you. The High Lord's golden eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Daniel stepped forward, standing eye to eye with the ruler of an empire. I won't bow to you, but I'll fight for her, the way she's fought for me. And if you don't like that, his gaze didn't waver, then try and stop me. Silence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. Then, a deep, low laugh. Daniel blinked. It was Varian. The Draxian prince leaned against one of the stone pillars, his injured shoulder still wrapped in golden cloth. His smirk was one of amusement, and something else. Respect. You actually have a spine, human, Varian said, shaking his head. I almost killed you yesterday, but I think I like you now. The nobles murmured amongst themselves. Some still looked appalled, but others, warriors, commanders, and strategists, nodded with approval. Finally, the High Lord exhaled. You are arrogant, he said. Daniel shrugged. So I've been told. The ruler's golden gaze lingered on him for a long moment. Then, at last, very well. The court fell silent. The High Lord stepped back, his voice booming across the chamber. By the laws of the Draxian Empire, I recognize Daniel Carter as the consort of my heir. The entire royal court erupted into noise. Some cheered, some grumbled, but it didn't matter. Daniel had won. Zyra let out a slow breath, stepping forward. For the first time in days, her expression softened. You did it, she whispered. Daniel smirked. You doubted me. Zyra shook her head. No, but I was afraid. Daniel reached out, taking her hand. Not anymore. An unwanted assassination attempt. The celebration didn't last long. That night, as Daniel and Zyra walked through the ornate halls of the palace, the sound of laughter and music from the feast still echoing in the distance. Something was wrong. Daniel felt it before he saw it. The hallway was too quiet. Zyra stopped walking. Her golden eyes sharpened. Then, a shadow moved. A blade lashed out from the darkness, aimed directly at Daniel's throat. Zyra reacted instantly, grabbing Daniel's arm and yanking him out of the way. The assassin's dagger missed his neck by inches, slicing through the air. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He twisted, slamming his elbow into the assassin's ribs. The attacker, dressed in *** blackened robes, their face hidden by a silver mask, ***, stumbled but didn't fall. Another figure emerged from the shadows. Then another. 3 assassins, all moving toward him. Zyra. I see them. The first assassin lunged again, but this time, Zyra was ready. She moved like a ghost, stepping past the strike and driving her knee into the assassin's chest. The attacker crashed against the wall, but before Zyra could finish him, the second assassin attacked Daniel. Daniel barely dodged. The dagger grazed his ribs, tearing his shirt. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, and countered with a punch to the attacker's jaw. The assassin staggered. Then, a plasma bolt tore through their chest. Daniel whipped around just in time to see Varian lowering his pistol, his smirk still in place. You two attract trouble, the prince muttered. Zyra exhaled. You have no idea. The last assassin turned to run. Daniel grabbed a fallen dagger and threw it. The blade whistled through the air and embedded itself into the attacker's leg. The assassin collapsed. Varian walked forward, stepping on the assassin's wrist before they could reach for their weapon. Who sent you? Varian asked coldly. The assassin spat blood onto the marble floor. You think this is over? The voice was hoarse, filled with hatred. The Empire will never be ruled by a human. Daniel sighed. Man, I was really hoping that wouldn't be a problem. Varian pressed harder, causing the assassin to grunt in pain. Who sent you? A small beeping sound suddenly filled the air. Daniel's eyes widened. Wait. Boom. The assassin detonated a suicide implant, vanishing in a burst of blue energy. Zyra cursed under her breath. Damn it. Varian shook his head. Looks like someone in the court still wants you dead. Daniel sighed. Of course they do. Zira grabbed his hand. We'll figure it out, she promised. Daniel glanced at her, then smirked. Yeah, he said. After all, I didn't marry a poor, dusty alien woman. I married the heir to a throne. Zira smirked back, and somewhere in the shadows of the Empire, enemies were watching.